If you have had years of low back pain, then you need to watch this video. Why? Because I'm going to give you 4 of the exact principles that I use for my clients who've even had 5 to 10 years of low back pain. Not only am I going to share with you the 4 principles, but also give you exercise examples that you can try as well. Low back pain is often a very poorly managed condition. The common things you hear are your core is weak, your hip flexors are tight, but the truth is, there is no one single cause. You have pain because your body thinks certain movements, as an example, bending forward, is a potential threat, not an actual one in a lot of cases. I see so many therapists promoting bracing and a neutral spine, but in the real world, these positions are just not realistic. The lowest hanging fruit is walking 8,000 steps a day, minimum. Not only has this been shown to improve back pain, but also your overall health. That's 8,000 mobility reps. Now you already have one piece of the puzzle. Here are the 4 principles that we will cover. Number 1 is training the core directly. Number 2 is learning to stack the pelvis and rib cage. Number 3 is laterally gliding the pelvis. And number 4 is training your low back directly. If we look at how the core functions, it helps flex and extend your spine. Therefore, if we train the core directly, we are also getting direct mobility work through the spine while strengthening the entire system. The key in these scenarios is to actually train heavily and progressively overload over time. Bodyweight crunches, planks, and other unloadable exercise variations just aren't good enough for elite performance. The reverse crunch is a great example where we are working our hip flexors, our bracing ability through flexion and extension through the spine, as well as mobilizing through flexion with a variety of ways to challenge this movement pattern further. If we want to make the exercise more challenging, we can bring our knees away from our chest. And if we want to make the exercise easier, we can bring our knees back towards the chest. Principle 2 is learning to stack the pelvis and rib cage. Anterior pelvic tilt gets way too much bad publicity as a cause of low back pain. And this is complete bullshit. There are no legitimate studies that show that anterior pelvic tilt causes low back pain. You can't change your anterior pelvic tilt and its structure unless you have surgery. But the important thing to mention is you do not need to, but you do need to learn how to stack the pelvis effectively by slightly posteriorly tilting. Here is an example of a squat, both starting in anterior pelvic tilt. As you can see here, I'm lowering with my bottom sticking out. Alternatively, if we start with a slightly tucked pelvis, as you can see here, we're stacking the rib cage much more effectively over the pelvis, which will help decompress the spine as we're squatting. Especially as we're starting to squat heavier, this is a really important principle to abide by. Principle number 3 is laterally gliding through the pelvis. In order to move effectively and take some of the load away from our low back, our pelvis needs to glide in the opposite direction to what we're side bending. As an example here, we're bending to the right side, so our hips need to shift out to the left. This example on this anatomy program shows the hips are not shifting, and this is something that will load up the low back and the spine more than if we can actually glide freely through the hips. Here are 2 examples of how we can get some lateral shifting through the hips. This exercise is called a side plank bench pump, and there's 2 variations. One is having our feet on the bench, and the other is having our hands and palm and forearm on the bench. With this variation here, you can get a really, really deep stretch, which is an excellent way to not only shift the pelvis, but also lengthen the obliques at the same time. Really good exercise, one of my favorites. And principle 4 is training the low back directly. Just look at the sheer amount of musculature that sits around the spine and low back. A lot of people have avoided moving, twisting, bending through these directions for years, and they wonder why their low back just isn't getting better. The amount of clients that I've helped resolve their low back pain issues by, guess what, training their low back directly is within the hundreds. If you're wanting to get bigger biceps, you do not train your calves for that. The same process applies when it comes to low back. These layers of muscle that you can work to getting stronger. 5-6 layers of muscles that reside around the low back, which we can tap into. This exercise here is a seated safety bar good morning.
It's an intermediate variation, but it's a really important one to showcase. Why? Because clearly we can load the low back very, very heavily. Obviously, at the start of the process, you start with lighter weights or even body weight based good mornings, but this is an excellent way to progressively overload and get extremely strong through all of those layers of your low back.
So now you have 4 of the most important biomechanical principles to resolving your low back pain. You can now use these principles and compare that to your current plan. One injury does not need to plague you for the rest of your life, but you do need to have a framework that is setting you up for success. If you want to learn more about injury rehab and elite performance, then subscribe to this channel.